What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Saw 10 or Saw X, the 10th installment in the Saw film franchise. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but here we are nearly 20 years after the release of the first one, and we've got 10 movies to dissect and break down and discuss. And I think there's a case to be made as Saw X is one of the stronger installments, although I must admit I'm not a connoisseur or an expert on the Saw franchise. I saw the first three. I think I saw the first one twice. And then I saw the Chris Rock spinoff Spiral, which was okay. And now I've seen this. I've seen half of the Saw films, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a good time. And I guess when you're reviewing a Saw movie, not just a horror movie, but a Saw movie, we kind of know it. We know the drill at this point. We know what to expect. And I think when you're watching these flicks, you have to ask yourself two questions. Was it fucking disgusting to the point where you were squirming in your seat? And for me, yes. And did I enjoy it? Yes. And when it comes to Saw movies, that's enough. And I watched it with a semi-crowded theater, and I'm going to make a case for why people should see this in the theater, because I think these kinds of movies play much better to a crowd. But right before the movie started, I was a little worried because there was a huge group of people that were laughing and screaming. And every time they saw a trailer, if they saw an actor they recognized, they'd be like, Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, they were raising hell. It's about to say, look, y'all should just go to a bar and just keep this momentum going. But then something magical happened. When this movie started, they all shut the fuck up and they just fell under its spell. And I think a lot of people are going to fall under the spell of this movie if they're willing to give it a chance. Obviously, when you're talking about torture porn movies, you're already dealing with kind of a narrow niche crowd within the overall horror genre. Because for a lot of people, when they go see a horror movie, they want to see a PG-13 teen slasher movie with, attractive high schoolers or college kids, trying to figure out who the killer is. And that's fine. Like, I have absolutely no use for those movies unless they're going for a hard R. But when it comes to torture porn, I mean, Jesus Christ, these are like the most aggressive and the most hardcore horror fans out there, like the kind of people who like seeing movies like Terrifier and Terrifier 2. I feel like those aren't necessarily torture porn. I feel like those have a lot more in common with like the classic kind of Nightmare on Elm Street movies or Friday the 13th movies. But in terms of the gore in those movies, they definitely feel like torture porn. And what do I mean by torture porn? For me, it's super easy to define. Are you watching torture in a movie and getting off on just how extreme it is and just how disgusting it is and just how elaborate and clever it is? And if you like seeing really gross, disgusting, elaborate traps that are about to rip people to pieces, but with a chance to escape, Saw X or Saw 10 will absolutely deliver. And I strongly recommend everybody just watch the trailer. The trailer actually was precisely why I went to see this. As I mentioned before, I'm not a huge Saw fan, but when I saw the trailer, I was like, God damn, I was like, that looks fucking entertaining as hell. And as it turns out, that indeed was the case. And so who made this movie, you might be asking yourself. And the twisted minds that are responsible are director Kevin Greutert. I don't know how to say his name, but he has been associated with this franchise for a long time. He was the director of Saw 6, he was the director of Saw 3D, and he was the editor on the original Saw, as well as Saw 2, as well as Saw 3. So he knows where the beating heart of this franchise lies. Oh, and he also edited Saw 4 and Saw 5. Jesus Christ, this guy's edited a hell of a lot of horror movies. I guess in the absence of James Wan, who directed the first one, he seems like the best candidate to direct these because he understands what makes these movies work, what makes them hum. And I should acknowledge that the editing in this movie is particularly good during the torture sequences, where a strange thing will happen where you'll feel conflicting emotions. You'll be writhing in your seat in agony over what's like on display, but due to the rhythm of the cutting and the music and like kind of the beat of the scene, you'll almost kind of involuntarily find yourself tapping your foot, anticipating what's about to happen. And I think the masterstroke of this movie is that it's all about giving Tobin Bell a chance to hog the spotlight for the majority of the movie. And I think he's emerged as one of my favorite anti-heroes in the world of horror, because he's not just like a bad guy who's just torturing people for his own shits and giggles. Like, at least in the case of this movie, he's got a very legitimate grievance. He's dying from a tumor in his brain. He's got a few months to live. And there's this clinic down in Mexico that promises a miracle cure or a miracle treatment. He goes down there. He empties his life savings. He gives all of his money to them to get a little more time on this planet. And as you see in the trailer, they're con artists, they're bullshit artists. And he's like, oh, well, Jesus Christ, well, sucks to be you, because I'm going to devise a series of elaborate traps to put all of you in a situation that you will not particularly enjoy. And as we also saw in the trailer, Amanda is back at his side, learning from the master all the weird, cruel shit that they like to inflict upon people. And she's played by the great Shawnee Smith, who I first saw in the 1988 remake of The Blob. That movie absolutely destroyed me. I was 12 years old when I saw it in the theater, and I was just absolutely thunderstruck. But I think that's one of the best horror remakes ever, and also some of the best practical effects of the 80s. I feel like when you're talking about horror remakes, obviously like The Thing and The Fly, they get all the attention and all the love, but The Blob deserves a lot of love as well. And Shawnee Smith, yeah, at this point, she is a full-blown scream queen because she's been doing really good work in the horror genre for fucking decades, and I thought she did an excellent job in this flick. And I think the reason the movie works as well as it does is that nothing about it feels phoned in, nothing about it feels like a quick cash grab. Like the writers, Peter Goldfinger and Josh Stolberg, they really went the extra mile and actually tried to craft like a really interesting thriller that has interesting kind of moral gray areas, because you're dealing with all these like criminals and con artists and the stooges that they use, and obviously psychopaths who design elaborate traps to kill people. But you've got all these people, none of whom are particularly good, but are all in this elaborate battle to the death. And I was on the edge of my seat right up until the bitter end, and that is rare. And once again, I feel like nobody asked them to make a movie as strong as this, but it seems like this is one of those movies where they really tried to make a movie for the diehard fans, for the original fans. It's got a budget of $13 million, which is pretty good for a horror film. But from what I'm reading on Wikipedia, they had their initial principal photography down in Mexico City, and then they took a giant break so that they could spend a lot of time and energy devising the most elaborate traps possible. And yeah, the traps are incredibly complex. And two of them really got under my skin. I'm not going to reveal which ones, but there was one where I was just like in a ball in my chair. And if you've seen the trailer, you've seen a tease of one of the elaborate traps. That's all I'll reveal. But goddamn, one of the traps in this is just fucking gross. And I guess it all depends upon, I guess, what phobias these traps are preying upon. Because if you have like a thing about your fingernails, you don't want to see any traps like manipulating people's digits. Or if you've got a thing about your brain, you don't want to see anything like, touching people's skulls and that sort of thing. Or if you're afraid of, amputation, like anything involving limbs is going to really get under your skin. So I guess what you bring to the table, like what phobias you bring in with you into the theater, it's going to dictate like which traps, which elaborate sequences are going to really fuck you up the most. But what really caught me off guard was the degree to which I was rooting for the character of Jigsaw, played by Tobin Bell. He really just owns this character at this point, and he's irreplaceable. But I found him to be strangely sympathetic, where I was like really rooting for him. He is a demented, strange individual, but he's got his own sense of honor. He's got his own sense of justice. He's got a code that he operates by. And I love watching him kind of speak in all these elaborate metaphors as he's talking to people, and they're kind of scratching their head in bewilderment as he's sharing his worldview with them. But he really believes that nobody is beyond redemption. Everybody deserves a fighting chance to live. Everybody deserves a fighting chance to prove that they can redeem themselves. And that makes his character strangely compelling. Yet another surprise was how the audience responded at the end of the film. Like, the ending is very solid. I'm not going to claim it's an ending on the level of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or an ending on the level of Evil Dead, or Night of the Living Dead, or the theatrical cut of The Exorcist. Like, when it comes to horror movies, or Rosemary's Baby, there are a lot of horror movies out there that have devastating final scenes or final shots. But I think the ending totally works. It's very satisfying. And a big chunk of the audience erupted in applause. I was like, what the fuck? I was like, I can't remember the last time I heard applause at a horror movie. Because like I can remember as a kid where I would like root for the bad guys. Like when I went to see Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors in the theater, that was my first Nightmare on Elm Street movie in the theater. And I remember when Freddy first slid into frame, my buddy and I, he was sitting beside me, we both went, yeah, like we were there to see Freddy fuck people up. But the character of Jigsaw is a little different, but clearly he has his fans, clearly he has his admirers, and so if you've ever been a fan of the kind of torture porn subgenre of horror, you're going to like this. I think this could end up being one of the surprise horror successes of the fall, although I think The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix could do well, but the one that I'm looking forward to the most is Suitable Flesh, which comes out at the end of October, directed by Joe Lynch, starring Heather Graham, and loosely based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Check out the trailer if you don't believe me, but that movie looks fucking bananas in the best possible way. But getting back to Saw X, aka Saw 10, I think one of the main reasons a lot of people are going to be drawn to this is they're going to respond to the practical effects. I won't say it feels retro or it feels old school, but it definitely feels like they're adhering to a style of filmmaking that was more prevalent in the early 2000s, where there wasn't digital blood or like digital de-aging of actors or anything like that. Like, I think a lot of people might have recommended the de-aging of the central characters, because in terms of the continuity, I believe this movie takes place in terms of the chronology between, hang on, I saw it earlier, yeah, it's both a direct sequel to Saw and a prequel to Saw 2, so it kind of fits right into the chronology about 19 years ago. And for some people, it might be distracting that the actors have gotten considerably older since then, but I have a very hard time being grossed out by or terrified by digital effects, and there are probably exceptions out there, but in general, it has to feel real. It has to be done in camera, like some of the shit you see in the Terrifier franchise when people are getting split in two. I mean, it has to look real, or there's just no emotional investment. So if you're a sucker for old school brutality, old school gore, old school torture with a nice, neat, satisfying, quote unquote happy ending, yeah, I strongly recommend that you hunt this down. But if you're not a connoisseur of horror movies or scary movies, you might be asking yourself at this point, what the hell is torture porn? And why do people use that phrasing? And why do people keep going back to see these movies? They sound utterly revolting. And it's hard to define specifically, but for me, they take their inspiration from the French extremity movement, or the new French extremity movement that was very prevalent in the aughts, like early 2000s up through about 2008, 2009. For whatever reason, there were a bunch of really legit, disturbing fucking movies coming out of France, which inspired a lot of the American counterparts in the horror scene. But some of these films, you might say, oh no, that's more art house, and it's just kind of bleeding over into French extremity. And some are full-blown genre films. And so whatever definition you want to use for the new French extremity or torture porn or whatever, have at it. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, but I do want to recommend a few of my favorites that I think are going to really fuck people up. So if you just wanted to talk about kind of full-blown art house French extremity and or torture porn movies, I think there are a few strong contenders. Claire Denis' film Trouble Every Day from 2001, starring Beatrice Dalle, if I'm saying her name correctly. It's I don't know if it's a cannibal movie or a vampire movie or a bit of both, but that one will really get under your skin. I feel like Claire Denis is very underrated as a director of some of the most disturbing films out there. Michael Haneke, he's an Austrian filmmaker, but makes movies in France. He has a film called Funny Games, which he then remade in English. Both of them are worth watching. Those are real fucking disturbing. But getting into the full-blown French genre films, High Tension from 2003, that was my gateway drug into this world. I saw that in the theater. I was absolutely blown away. Irreversible by Gaspar Noé. Some might say that's more of just a full-blown art house film, but it is easily one of the most disturbing films of the 21st century. I mean, it is savage and brutal. I don't believe in trigger warnings or anything like that, but if any film ever deserved a trigger warning, it is Irreversible, because it's not disturbing we're watching a movie and having fun and we're getting scared. It's a deeply unsettling film on so many levels. Another good one from France is Inside from 2007, also starring Beatrice Dalle. Maybe my favorite of all of these French extremity films would be Martyrs from 2008. I had to buy the DVD. It's hard to find, and it's hard to find in French with English subtitles. But if you make the effort and you find the movie, it's a very special, disturbing work of art. It gets my highest possible recommendation. When you're ready, if you've watched all the teen slasher movies out there and you're bored by all that bullshit, you might be ready for Martyrs. But tread lightly. It is not for everybody. And then, of course, you have some of the more, notorious or silly examples like Human Centipede. And in America, every once in a while, someone makes an attempt at it. Like, obviously, Eli Roth did Hostel 1 and Hostel 2. I don't know how well those movies have aged. I haven't revisited those movies in a long time. But at the heart of every single conversation about torture porn movies is always going to be the Saw franchise. It's probably the most popular and most famous, practitioner of this strange category of filmmaking. And I'm not going to claim that I'm some diehard for these kinds of movies. I only need a very small dose of these kinds of movies in my overall media diet. In my media diet, we need a little sports, we need a little comedy, we need some news, we need some books. Everybody likes to have a lot of variety in their overall media diet. But every once in a while, one of these movies comes along that grabs my attention. But if you're one of those people that in the 1980s and 1990s would go to the video store and would just walk down the horror section alphabetically, I haven't seen this one yet, and basically where you would watch everything, at a certain point, you just kind of get numb to horror movies, or you get a little jaded, you get a little cynical, and it takes a lot to give you the jolt that you crave from a great horror experience. And I think these French extremity films absolutely deliver on that front. And I imagine that they might even seem more disturbing now than they did 15 years ago because so few movies like that are being made today. And so I think for people who came of age in the social media era, they might be quite shocked and horrified by the kinds of movies that were made right before Facebook and Twitter kind of changed culture as we know it. But at this point, I'm officially rambling. I hope I've given you some good recommendations, and I hope I've persuaded a few people to check out Saw X, aka Saw 10. But that's all I can say without divulging spoilers about the movie, which I don't want to do. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrex if you have some other recommendations on this front. But I hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.